Thank you, everybody. Hello, David. You're looking good.
Ah, good to see you, Art.
Good to see you.
Thanks for having me. Sorry I can't be up in that chair next to you, but it was just a little bit too crazy a day here in D.C.
It's a chair of honor, and I should tell everybody that David was a huge hit back here a few years ago, and invited him back, and he agreed to come back. And we had a car all set up to take him up from the course he teaches at Harvard and come down here and so forth. And there are a lot of military in the audience, David, and they understand orders, and they understand change of orders. And your commanding officer, the New York Times, informed you that the president of Finland was going to be in Washington, and you would be too. And you know how to salute, so that's why you're in Washington, but I'm glad you're here virtually. And I should say that, including the audience here, you're also on Zoom. Several World Affairs Councils in different parts of the United States are listening in. And eventually, if one of my questions is going to be about your session with the president of Finland, first of all, just to bring people up to speed about you, he teaches at the Kennedy School. He's the most senior reporter on the subject of national security matters for the foremost newspaper in the United States. I kind of look at David as a bit of a Renaissance man. I mean, he covers national security, but he's got all kinds of other interests, domestic and international. He's been with the Times for more than 3 decades. And he's most widely known for having covered the White House and national security, defense and intelligence issues. But he also spent 6 years in Tokyo as the Japan correspondent of the New York Times. He was also the economics correspondent in Washington for the New York Times. And after you've talked to him about some other things, you find it's absolutely a limitless range of interests and expertise. He's always a treat. Now, David was on 3 teams that won Pulitzer Prizes for the New York Times. He's written 2 bestsellers. His most recent book was The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, which also became an HBO documentary. And I'll ask you a question about that one, too. I recommend that book, so much so that I teach a course at the University of Connecticut, and that is one of the texts that we use. It's an outstanding book. Now, there's an old saw in Washington and around the country that the one phone call that you always take is the President of the United States is on line 1. You always take that call. You can't not take it. Well, among national security kinds of people, intelligence, defense, White House, David Sanger's on the phone and would like to speak to you. You take the call. Why do you take the call? First of all, he's writing about something significant. David, they don't assign him and he doesn't cover insignificant things. It's important. Second, all the players that count in this town and around the country are going to read what he's going to write. And third, he'll treat you fairly. He'll listen to you. He'll protect confidentiality. It's a good dialogue. He knows that he's going to need to call you next month, next week, a couple of months from now, whatever. It's a relationship that continues. So a corollary to the old saw is, if you're in the field of national security, as people in this room are interested, you take the call from David Sanger. So thanks. We're here in Hartford, David. The topic is Age of Instability. And I understand that you're working on a new book. And I wonder if you could, just to kick things off, tell us about that book, the subject, what you're finding, kind of a prelude to what we're going to be reading whenever it is published.
Great. Well, thanks, Art, and great to be back with you. And it's such a great program that the World Affairs Council does there in Connecticut. And I'm just sorry I can't be with you. I wish I could say the New York Times had actually assigned me to go see the Finnish president. But in fact, the Finnish president's folks just had called, and he is here, obviously, as many leaders are, right after the UN General Assembly. And this was our one moment to get together, and it's a pretty critical moment for him because Finland is acceding to NATO. This is moving faster than people thought, and we can come back in a little bit to that because when we last met, the whole idea that Finland or Sweden would become members of NATO seemed pretty far-fetched. So it's pretty interesting that this is happening. To your broader point, I think when we look back at the post-Trump era and the Biden era, we're going to say that, you know, if the Trump administration was about the strange ways that Donald Trump was trying to change the country and the governance of the nation, the Biden years have really been about the reemergence of superpower conflict. And by that, I mean both Russia and China. We spent the past 25 years, really backward, I should say the past 21 years post 9/11, thinking about Afghanistan, counterterrorism, the invasion of Iraq. And while those were big, traumatic, and very vitally important issues for the United States, we engaged in them because we thought we had a bit of a holiday from history here, that the big issues of dealing with the largest powers on earth were pretty much behind us, and that they had ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we went through nearly 3 decades where we persuaded ourselves that economic interests and economic efficiency were not only flattening the world and leading to a more globalized economy, but that was driving politics. And that as a result, Russia and China both would find it in their economic interest to put aside the territorial disputes, the issues of worrying about internally ethnic tensions within their own countries or nationalistic tensions that come from the breakup of the Soviet Union, and that all that would be put aside because the Russians would want to become part of Europe. And, you know, that was the driving force during the Bush administration, and that was a driving force to some degree during the Obama administration. And that China, while it was a rising power and certainly viewed itself as at some point surpassing the United States as the major global power, didn't want to break so much of the existing order that it would get in the way of their own economic interests as they both gathered new technologies and shipped technology and other products around the world. We now look at that very differently. China has made it abundantly clear as recently as this summer that Xi Jinping isn't messing around when he says that he is going to solve the unification of China and Taiwan problem while he is still in office. And he, of course, next month, he is going to emerge from the Communist Party Congress with a mandate for a 3rd term and maybe more as the most powerful Chinese leader probably since Mao. Russia we saw as a disruptor. There were hints all along the way from Vladimir Putin's speech to the Munich Security Conference back in, 2007, where he was sort of laying out his agenda. But we didn't really believe that he would take ridiculous risk in order to go rebuild the Russia of his dreams, which is different than rebuilding the Soviet Union. But going back to the days, remember, what he keeps in his office is not a bust of Lenin, but a bust of Peter the Great, right? And rebuilding the Russian state. And what we've discovered since February 24th was he would be willing to sort of risk it all in order to begin to bring about that vision. I don't know what it is about authoritarian leaders as they approach 70, but they both seem to be determined to have an extremely strong legacy out here of national reunification on terms that they dictate. And what the book is trying to do is, in a narrative way, explain that era.
I'm interested, David, as you talk to people about that issue, I could see at least two reactions, and maybe there are more. One is, I've been worried about this. I've been seeing bits and pieces of it, but I haven't put it together in a coherent whole, and I'm glad you're addressing it. On the other hand, you could have, I hadn't been thinking along those lines, and I'll be eager to see what you write. What have you been finding as you've been talking to people in the national security realm about these ideas?
Oh, most of them are way ahead of me on this, as usual, Art. I was flattered by your introduction, but if I understand 5% of what's going on a day I'm wandering around Washington, I consider it to be a good day. But I think when you talk to the people who are really absorbed in dealing with the National Security Staff, Secretary of State on down, State Department, Lloyd Austin, and Pentagon leadership, these are the issues that grip them each and every day. And it didn't start with the Biden administration waking up to this. If you remember back to the first national security strategy, the only national security strategy published by the Trump administration, when H.R. McMaster was still the national security advisor, that national security strategy described the reemergence of superpower conflict as being the dominant threat facing the United States. And it was the first national security strategy since 9/11 that turned away from counterterrorism as the critical issue facing the United States. I didn't say that was unimportant, just that if you were ranking major threats, it didn't rank as number one anymore. Makes sense that 21 years after an event, even one as horrific as that so affected our lives, and certainly the lives of so many in Connecticut and New York, that the world shifts and moves on to other threats and other issues. We'll talk a little bit later on about cyber as a major component in that. But one thing that I think everybody I talk to recognizes is that it would be easy to say that we're slipping back into the old Cold War. And if you thought that, I think you cut yourself off from some of the biggest themes that we are dealing with in this new age. Because this is very unlike the Cold War, particularly in dealing with China. Technology has changed all of that. During the Cold War, we weren't dependent on supply chains from our major rival at that time, which was the Soviet Union. And even today from Russia, we are not particularly dependent. What were the last Russian products, Art, that you bought that weren't caviar and vodka, right? I mean, not a whole lot in your house that's Russian made. But from China, it's a very different circumstance, starting with your cell phone, where Apple has been trying desperately to figure out a way to become less dependent on assembling the cell phone in China. And as we've reported in the Times, has been highly unsuccessful so far in diversifying its sourcing. But that's just a small part of it. We are in a very different dynamic than we were in the Cold War time. And part of that is that Russia and China, two countries that historically have not cared for each other very much, are unifying around their distaste for American dominance. And the question is, a question we can't really resolve right now, is that for show, or is there something deeper and real going on there? And if it is deeper and real, then we're in a quite different world and a quite different kind of competition than we were from the time that the Soviets exploded their first nuclear weapon in the late 1940s through to the fall of the Berlin Wall.
It's appropriate that these thoughts be before the World Affairs Council. And as you know, one of the founding reasons, the impetus behind creation of the World Affairs Councils was to combat isolationism in the 20s, and then after the world order of World War II, to sustain American engagement in a productive and constructive way in leading the world. And we have just heard today about challenges in Europe. The leader, the director of National Intelligence, Admiral Blair, whom you dealt with a lot, is sitting a few rows up here, and he talked about where Asia is right now. Now, given what you have just described, this evolving, not threats, but an evolving international situation, is the United States up for it? Can we? I just heard the other day that 57 members of the House of Representatives have indicated they're no longer enthusiastic about providing military assistance to Ukraine. Withdraw, America first. There is a lot of reluctance to be an effective leader in the world. So I'm curious, as you look at not only the rise of other powers, how do you see the United States rising to the challenges that you're writing about?
Well, the Trump years were a significant sort of change of tone, right? America first, which is a phrase that first came out of an interview I did with Donald Trump, and I'll tell you the story in a moment, in 2016 during the campaign, I think profoundly changed the way not only the world perceived America, but the way the Republican Party perceived its own role. Republicans in the Cold War were really the party of international engagement and international trade. It was the Democrats, in fact, who were sort of opposing free trade agreements and so forth, and were usually more reluctant to spend on, military presence around the world. We're looking more to cut back on defense budgets, particularly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, so that we could spend more on social issues at home. And there was a significantly good argument for that. The Republican Party of today is quite different. It has really absorbed much of the Trump America First mantra, some with more interest than less. But the fact of the matter is, that's where most of the concern about continuing to fund Ukraine, not only for military support, but just for support of its general government, is beginning to emerge. Now, that said, when Finland and Sweden, when the Senate had to go approve the change terms for NATO to allow Finland and Sweden in recently, the vote was 95 in favor. When was the last time you saw something go through the Senate with 95 votes? I'm having a hard time remembering that in the past decade or two. But there is a growing concern that we are now in not for a brief war, but a long war, and what that's going to go cost. And, the Senate the House and Senate did approve $52 billion. That's a lot. Hasn't all been spent by a long shot for Ukraine, but I think it's going to be hard to gather much enthusiasm for going back for more. And that, of course, is exactly what Vladimir Putin is counting on. He is counting on the United States suffering from its usual attention deficit syndrome when it comes to international issues. He sees that, we fought in Afghanistan for 20 years and then decided we weren't getting very far, that we've been out of Iraq for some time. He's betting that Europe will fracture as the cost of not having a steady flow of gas and oil from Russia sets in this winter. And so his bet is that the alliance does not hold together on this. I actually think he's wrong, given what the depth of what he has done and the horrific nature of what he's done. But history does suggest we do have short attention spans on these issues.
Maybe this is a good time to talk about Finland. Does everybody here promise to buy the New York Times tomorrow and read what David's going to write? And if so, based on that, could you give us a little, a little read ahead as to what you found in your conversation and what we're about to read about it?
I mean, it's nothing I'm going to write on imminently, and so no shocks out here. I think what I was concluding from talking to not only the Finnish president, but other leaders who've been in and out of the UN this week and here in Washington is the following: that Putin fundamentally miscalculated on what the world reaction would be, what the Ukrainian reaction would be, and what his own populace's reaction would be. And let's take those in order. For the world, I think he looked at the annexation of Crimea back in 2014 and said, what happened to me? Well, it took a year for the Europeans to go figure out what kind of sanctions they were going to do. They ultimately did them only after MH17 was shot down, the commercial airliner. The sanctions in the end didn't really shake Putin's world particularly. And he thought this was going to be a 3-day war where the reaction would be the same. He'd be condemned for a week or a month. There'd be some token sanctions, but people would move on. That gets to his second miscalculation. He miscalculated the Ukrainians, how much they had invested in defense, how much they had done to toughen up and build resilience in the cyber arena, in the military arena, how much nationalism there was in Ukraine as a separate entity. And, in polls a few years ago, people were 50-50 about whether or not they would be better associating with Russia or with the West. And as soon as the invasion happened, all of the interest in affiliating with Russia seemed to disappear. He miscalculated on the war. He thought it was going to be a really brief 3-day thing. He miscalculated on how well trained and how devoted his own troops were. He didn't tell his own troops and his own generals that they were not out on some kind of a military exercise, but actually we're going to go do an invasion. And he certainly didn't count on the number of casualties. We don't know very well exactly what those were, but the British estimates are 20,000 Russians dead in the past 7 months and another 60,000 injured. Now, think about that. We lost in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars over the course of 2 decades. We lost a little over 7,000 Americans killed. Tragedy, each and every one of them. But that was over 20 years. If the British are close to right, and they've lost 20,000 in 7 months, that's pretty wild, and explains the decision that he announced the other day to call up another 300,000, although those will be pretty poorly trained. So that was the next miscalculation. The third miscalculation was how this would play at home. The reason he didn't want to do a general mobilization was largely he had people who were at the lower end of the income spectrum and frequently not ethnic Russians in the way that Putin would define them, fighting this war. He did not have middle-class kids from St. Petersburg and Moscow fighting this war. Now with this general mobilization, I think there's a lot of fear of who's going to get drawn into this. And that's why you're seeing this flee to the airports and to borders that has been the remarkable and embarrassing result the past couple of days.
We got a lot more. I want to include the audience, and I reserve the right to ask about cybersecurity, but he's been very provocative. Who's got a question here to throw in at this point? Anybody? All right. While they're wandering around and thinking of their questions, David, suppose your publisher said, the perfect weapon, war, sabotage, and fear in the cyber age. That was a great book. We want you to write a sequel or a chapter to it. If you were to think about when the book came out and the profound effect it had, it's been a couple of years now. What subsequent thoughts do you have about the premises of that book and where we stand in the world of cyber today? And I say that because a lot of the cadets, midshipmen, we got the Coast Guard, Air Force Academy, West Point, Annapolis, all here. A number of them are into cyber, and that's part of their careers. So what would you write now, and what should they know?
Well, part of this book, and particularly the technology part of the new book, is intended as a successor to The Perfect Weapon. And the book came out in 2018, summer of 2018. The documentary came out 2 years ago, October of 2020. And just to whet your appetite, next month there'll be another HBO doc on Biden's first year in national security, done by the same team that did the Perfect Weapon. So if you're interested in a bit of an update, good place to go. So what's changed? A couple of things. First of all, when the book came out, ransomware was not a major phenomenon. It happened a bit, but it's certainly what we had not seen things like Colonial Pipeline, which was, you'll remember, the attack last year on the small company that runs the pipelines that run basically up the East Coast, carrying about half of the fuel, mostly gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel, that supplied the East Coast. The ransomware attack was a criminal act from a Russian group against this small company just to extort money from them. What did the company do? It panicked and shut down the pipeline for fear that the code would get into their operating systems. And suddenly the United States government was looking at gas lines at a time of plentiful provision of gas. This really got President Biden's attention. And it's what led to that one meeting he's had as president of Vladimir Putin. That was in Geneva in June of 2021, and I was out covering it at the time. And that meeting was not about Ukraine, although Ukraine was mentioned briefly. It was about Biden warning Putin that attacks on American infrastructure, even if it is by criminal groups based in Russia, was something he would be held responsible for. And at one point even said to him kind of darkly, you know, you've got a lot of pipelines too. You might want to think about how you'd feel if somebody interfered with those. Interesting line coming from the president. We now know that these ransomware groups, while largely criminal, are sometimes used by the state. And so we have this strange merging since the book came out of criminal activity and state activity, where the hardest issue is to sort of deconflict is, what is this? Is this just purely a criminal attack? Is it a state attack? Is it a state attack that is disguised as a criminal attack? And that's been one of the big changes. The second big change, Art, is that the book described the use of cyber as the perfect weapon for short of war operations. That is to say, if you want to attack another country, but you don't want to get into a direct military conflict with them, doing a hard to attribute cyber attack seemed to be the best way to diminish their power and send a warning, whether that was turning off the power, the electric power, or whether it was attacking communication systems and so forth. Today, we have seen with Ukraine the first kinetic war between two sophisticated cyber powers. The Ukrainians are quite good. And we have seen that cyber was less useful in turning off Ukraine than we might have anticipated. We were worried leading up to early February, the first thing that the Russians would do would be shut off all of the power grid in Ukraine, since they had practiced by doing those attacks on Ukraine in 2015 and 2016 that are described in the book. Instead, we discovered that once you've started a full-scale war, it's sort of easier to drop a bomb or aim a missile at a power substation than it is to try to figure out how to get in with code. And yet cyber has played a very big behind-the-scenes role. And so have American companies that have kept the Ukrainian government afloat by picking up their data and moving it to the cloud, to places that the Russians couldn't attack. It's part of why you see the Ukrainian government up and running today.
Questions? Young lady right here. Could you state your name, introduce yourself, and have at it?
Hi, I'm Nina Grant. I'm a junior. And my question is, how does cybersecurity impact underdeveloped countries if it affects them at all?
Oh, it affects them a lot. And there are a couple of different ways. So the first is you'll remember the big disputes that we had with China in recent years about the spread of Huawei technology to build 5G networks. These are high-speed networks. And while China was trying to build in the United States, United Kingdom, in very sophisticated countries like Britain and throughout Europe, what they were really trying to do was wire up countries that were at a much earlier stage of development in hopes that that would change the way that they would have influence over those nations in the future. That if you owned their networks, you owned the country in many ways. And that struggle is still underway. You don't see much in the way of Huawei in the US and among NATO countries, but boy, you travel to Latin America or Southeast Asia, it's pretty much all you see. And so the networks have become the new way that China, and in response, the United States and the West, using Nokia and Siemens, Samsung, other built networks, are competing for influence and control, because what the Chinese know is that if they can go sell a network to a country, they can say, hey, look, we will throw in along the way a good authoritarian's package that will enable you to track dissidents in your country, that will enable you to do facial recognition in crowds, everything that China uses to control its own population. So there's a huge amount at stake here as we think about who's running the networks, particularly in the developing world.
A bit of a provocative question. When people go to the War College, when they become officials in national security, they learn you have to deal with the media. Up to that point, though, a lot of military people are apprehensive. My gosh, the military, I'm not authorized, et cetera, et cetera. We got the future leadership is here. And I was struck when you and I used to talk in Washington that it's at that most senior level that people learn they have to be a player. To be a player means you have to deal with the media. But up until that point, there's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of, gosh, what's going to happen to me if I talk to a reporter? You're in the business of getting people to talk to you, and I must say that from experience, you're pretty good at it. What would you tell people starting their military career about what they should anticipate? How the media can be, effective use of the media can be good for their careers. What advice would you have for them, David?
Well, as you're making your way up, at lower levels, obviously you're going to be cautious and, not talk to reporters unless, so authorized and so forth. And, while we talk to people when we're out and around, I can fully understand that. But there is a crossover point in one's career where you've got to do two different things. One is understand how the media operates. And the second is understand when it is that you need to be able to explain publicly what it is you're doing. We spend a lot of time in this in the national security course that I teach, and we've got a lot of military fellows who are in it who are sort of mid-career and sort of confronting this issue for the first time. So what do I mean by that? The first is that the media is very likely to define the atmosphere of the battlefield you are on. So think about Afghanistan and Iraq. The United States was all in to the Afghan war until the invasion of Iraq, at which point huge numbers of assets that were initially being used in Afghanistan were shifted over to Iraq. It was a big strategic decision, and many would argue today a big strategic mistake. That one of the reasons that we sort of lost our focus in Afghanistan, that we didn't have sufficient resources there, that the Taliban came back the way they did, was that we divided our attention. And when we first wrote that as a very big story that David Rode and I did in 2007 called How the Good War Went Bad, there were a lot of people in the Bush administration who were pushing back on that concept. They're saying, oh, there was no way we were neglecting one to fight the other. But when we look back in history now, that's exactly what was happening. So one of the things that the media does is it gives a sense of overview that if you're fighting down in the trenches worried about your specific mission, you might not be seeing at the time. The second is we live in a democracy. Our military is out fighting on behalf of the American people. And while there's a chain of command and people have to respect that for sure, there's also a necessity to explain what is being done on behalf of the American people. And that's why, everything from the effects of drone warfare, which when it started was working under many fewer rules than it is today, to the effects of cyber warfare, which is still kept far more secret. I mean, we hear a lot about the attacks on the US, but as Admiral Blair in the audience and others will attest, I think the United States is spending billions of dollars on offensive cyber. And it's our view that we have to cover that as aggressively as we cover those states that are attacking the United States.
I'm sure that may be true, but Admiral Blair is not one to go into great detail about explaining our offensive steps we're taking in cybersecurity.
And because he can't, we do.
Very good. Fair enough. Are there questions? Yeah, over here. Let's see. Yeah, sir. Right down here, we got one. Yep.
Hi, how are you, sir? Cadet Abdul Razak from the United States Military Academy. Quick question. You've done a great job kind of explaining from a realist perspective the Ukraine situation. Personally, as an international affairs major, I kind of want to get your opinion on a constructivist perception. So we just discussed media. How do you think media has affected the war efforts from, especially in our political figures in the fight, like President Zelensky and Mr. Putin? How do you think the media association with them as figures of head of state has propelled the war or advanced it?
Well, it's a great question. I think one of the big issues that we're going to be struggling with for a long time is why was it that the Russians allowed President Zelensky in the early days of the war to still keep communicating with his people so well? Because he has been brilliant on both sort of a propaganda sense, I say that in the best use of the term, and in an inspiration sense in getting the country both organized and fighting, something we did not expect from somebody whose previous history had been basically a comedian who played a president rather than a real president. But his sort of Churchill in a t-shirt nightly inspirational talks that play out on YouTube and so forth have been absolutely critical to unifying the Ukrainian state and organizing this counteroffensive and selling that counteroffensive and allowing for a way for Europe and the United States to funnel aid to him because they, saw themselves inspired by his pluckiness. The other day, he spoke sort of directly to Putin in one of these releases where he said, if we have to choose between our economy and you, we choose defeating you. If we have to choose between, eating sand and having you around, we're going to fight having you around, right? He has been, gotten out ahead of the Russians in a way that I think the Russians couldn't anticipate. Putin himself has, I think, done himself probably more harm than good with his episodic threats to use nuclear weapons or all weapons in our arsenal. He thought he could control the narrative here. And what you're seeing play out in Russia right now suggests that that control, while he may regain it, isn't as great as we first anticipated.
David, we're getting toward the end. One of the things that when you and I did this in the past, we kind of privately canoodled on the side, and I said, what else is going on? What would be a good question for me to ask you? And you said, ask me about this that just happened because it's relevant and it's interesting. Now, I have to do that publicly, which is a little embarrassing to me, but did you come in today hoping that there would be a certain question or something else that you would add to your discussion with this group today that I haven't brought forth?
Well, I think one of the things that, we touched briefly on China before. I think one of the risks for the United States is that Russia and Ukraine is the urgent issue, much as Afghanistan was 21 years ago. China is the long range and long run issue. And what we saw happen this summer when Nancy Pelosi's visit gave the Chinese the excuse to try to change the status quo, go over that median barrier in the Taiwan Strait, do a practice run for what it would be like to try to choke off and gradually squeeze Taiwan, was a big game changer. And we all know that as the Ukraine war plays out, the Chinese are watching this and wondering how this might apply to China's case should it move against Taiwan. And it's hard to read that right now, Art, because, a lot of American companies picked up and left Russia. A lot of them, Microsoft and Google among them, entered the war on Ukraine's behalf, helping build up their defenses against cyber attack. But let's face it, American companies that left Russia at most had a couple of percentage points of their revenue dependent on sales in Russia. If we ask them to leave China or to stop doing business in China or to stop manufacturing in China, that would be a very different thing. And so I think everybody's sort of got to stop and inhale and begin to think in a broader way. If we are headed down a road for the defense of Taiwan, how far are we willing to go? How far do the Chinese think we're willing to go? It's been fascinating that President Biden has come out 4 times now in the past 8 or 9 months and said, we will directly defend Taiwan. And every time his staff has come out and said, no, nothing's changed from the Taiwan Relations Act and the communiques. They went through the whole routine. But I think something has changed. And we're all trying to figure out what exactly that is, whether we're at the end of that age of strategic ambiguity that has helped keep the peace between China, Taiwan, and the United States for so long.
Time with you is always a special treat. You have been provocative and you've really enriched our program here today, David. And I hope we can get you to do it again in the future. Please, everybody, join me in thanking David Sanger for his time with us today.
Thank you very much. It's been great to be with you. Wish I could be there myself.
Thanks, David.